have two panels, Lasse Thomassen from Queen Mary University of London, and then we'll have Giorgos Katsambekis here from the University of Aristotle University. And Giorgos told me that I should play the role of Merkel because we are running out of time, so I should control very, very hard the time, and I will try to do the best for that. So, Lasse, 20 minutes, the floor is yours.
Okay, let's see. Does this work? Yeah, that works very well. So, oh, right. So, the title of my presentation is Taking Representation Seriously, the Multitude versus the People. It's going to be mostly about, it's going to be mostly about the second part of the title. I'm going to leave out most of the representation stuff. And mainly to talk about the multitude and the people. So the topic of the paper is this debate between the multitude and the people. And this debate, I think, is very relevant and important for discussions about populism today, the topic of the conference, and especially left populism, because for one side of this debate, populism is at the very best a distraction, at worst it's dangerous and detrimental to any new project for the left. Whereas for the other side, populism is the possibility for the left in Europe and elsewhere. What I'd like to do is try to start challenging, maybe deconstructing this opposition between the multitude and the people. And then at the very end, I will end with a couple of comments on how this relates to the situation in Spain around Podemos, and maybe it's also relevant for Syriza in Greece today. So that's the plan. So this debate between the multitude and the people, it has different names, more or less naming the same debate: the multitude versus the people, autonomy versus hegemony, horizontalism versus verticalism. And we can take Hardt and Negri to represent the first part of each of those pairs, and then I will take Laclau and Mouffe to represent the latter part of each of those pairs. Obviously, this debate between the multitude and the people has its basis in some deep and very important theoretical, philosophical differences. But the differences between and the debate is mainly, I think, more interestingly, and it's more visible when it comes to politics, and especially questions around organization and strategy. So when it comes to means and discussions about strategy, about the role of the party, the role of the state, and so on. Now, Laclau and Mouffe's main criticism of Hardt and Negri is that Hardt and Negri do not have a theory of politics. Theory of politics understood as political articulation of differences into a counter-hegemonic force. They assume the unity and the immediacy of the multitude, and they lack a theory of political subjectivity. Now, Hardt and Negri's response is to eschew the choice that Laclau and Mouffe present them with. They say, I quote now, spontaneity and hegemony are not the only alternatives. The multitude can develop the power to organize itself through the conflictual and cooperative interactions of singularities in the common, the multitude, end of quote. The problem with hegemony then is that it's neither desirable nor effective to impose unity, hierarchy, and centralism, maybe also identity, on what should rightly be horizontal relations among autonomous singularities. And this is very well expressed in the way that Hardt and Negri oppose the multitude to the people. So they write, whereas the people is formed as a unity by a hegemonic power standing above the plural social field, the multitude is formed through articulations on the plane of immanence without hegemony. End of quote. And then looking at movements like Occupy and the Indignados, Hardt and Negri find there an expression of the democracy of the multitude. And they write, these movements are powerful not despite their lack of leaders, but because of it. They are organized horizontally as multitudes, and their insistence on democracy at all levels is more than a virtue, but a key to their power. End of quote. Now, Mouffe argues that these sorts of movements, I quote here, are valuable for enriching democracy, However, this is only the beginning, she continues, and to effectively transform power relations, the new consciousness that arises out of those protests, those movements, requires institutional channels. End of quote. So the solution for her, and as it was for Laclau, was the creation of a populist discourse and engagement with existing institutions. I now want to go on to look a little bit more in detail at some of the theory of hegemony and Laclau and Mouffe, and then after that at some of the things that Hart and Negri say about the multitude and the construction of the multitude. So first, Laclau and Mouffe. And here I want to focus just on 2 points out of several points. And first of all, I want to go back to Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, written in the early 1980s and published in 85. And looking at that, it's clear that this book, it was written against the backdrop of the disappointment with traditional socialist and Marxist politics. And I think it's often forgotten today, but it was written from the perspective of the plurality of social and political struggles, new social movements, or whatever we call them. Struggles, movements that couldn't be, or at least they weren't, represented by traditional organizations on the left. So at the core of the book were these new social and political movements of civil society. Now, given that Laclau and Mouffe drew so heavily on Gramsci, it's not surprisingly that they would, in a sense, turn away from the party and turn away from the state, with a capital P and with a capital S, and turn towards the pluralism of civil society. True for both Gramsci and for Laclau and Mouffe, the aim is for a cultural and social hegemony to become state, as it were. But there's a recognition that counter-hegemony starts with a crisis of society and with the creation of a new constellation of forces within that society. Now, in her most recent book, Agonistics, Chantal Mouffe addresses precisely this issue in the context of a discussion of Occupy and also the Indignados in Spain. And there she writes about these, or she concludes that, she criticizing them, and then she concludes saying that, now I'm quoting her, critique of horizontalism doesn't imply that these practices do not have a role to play in an agonistic democracy. I'm convinced that the variety of extra-parliamentary struggles and the multiple forms of activism outside traditional institutions are valuable for enriching democracy. And she continues, not only can they raise important questions and bring to the fore issues that are neglected, they can also lead to the emergence of new subjectivities and provide a terrain for the cultivation of different social relations. End of quote. So these extra institutional, informal, social, and political movements are important to Mouffe's conception of democracy, agonistic democracy. Of course, what remains then is to examine how these subjectivities, these new subjectivities emerged and how they can be cultivated and how they can have a continuing influence on institutional politics, for instance, through a populist party. Now, I want to also mention here a slightly more technical aspect of Laclau and Mouffe's theory of hegemony. And here again, I want to go back to hegemony and social strategy and start from there. Recall that Laclau and Mouffe, they think about hegemony as the articulation of a chain of equivalence among different struggles or different identities. The chain as a whole is represented by a nodal point in hegemony and socialist strategy and by an empty signifier in emancipation in Laclau's later work, for instance, the populist leader. Now, in Laclau's work, there was a tendency to reduce politics to hegemony and hegemony to populism, whereby politics and hegemony become a simple vertical relation between leader and people, representative and represented. But this reduction is impossible, and for reasons that Laclau himself explains. So consider first the chain of equivalence. The chain of equivalence is a chain of equivalence, not identity. That is, the different identities or struggles in the chain remain just that, different. Indeed, we could say that they remain singular vis-à-vis one another and vis-à-vis this so-called empty signifier, the chain as a whole, the people, for instance. And this is so because the empty signifier is always... The empty signifier, oh, yes, that's it. Wow, now I can hear myself. I don't know if I like that. Yeah, okay, I accept it. So where was I? So the empty signifier, the reason is that the empty signifier is always going to be a limited space of representation from the perspective of those differences in the chain. In other words, because the so-called, and it's precisely so-called empty signifier is not actually empty, but also one difference among other differences in the chain of equivalence, because of this, then the differences in the other differences in the chain of equivalence cannot be reduced to the identity represented by the empty signifier, to the identity of the people, for instance, or the populist leader, whatever it is. There's always a tension between the empty signifier, so-called, and the other parts of the chain of equivalence. There's always a tension between the way the people is represented and those who identify with the people or who are identified with the people. And that also means that the identity of the chain of equivalence is never completely fixed, but is always in a process of being re-articulated. So pluralism, difference, singularity, these are inherent to hegemony. Without those, there would be no hegemony, hegemony understood as the contingent articulation of identities. This would be impossible. Now, turning to Hart and Negri, so here the starting point is that the multitude, the singularities of the multitude will leap vertically and in an unmediated fashion to struggle against empire. So no articulation of the multitude or of what it's struggling against, empire, is necessary. And this is what prompts Leclerc and Mouffe's critique that Hart and Negri, they say they don't have a theory of articulation, or put differently, they don't have a theory of political subjectivity. Now, as Alexandros has rightly pointed out, Hart and Negri have moved to some extent moved away from this more spontaneous position. And they now stress the need for some sort of articulation. So for instance, in Multitude, they write of the emergence of the multitude as capable of democratic decision-making. They say, this process is anything but spontaneous and improvised. The destruction of sovereignty, the sovereignty of empire, must be organized to go hand in hand with the constitution of new democratic institutional structures based on existing conditions, end of quote. And in Commonwealth, they write, I quote again, political organization is needed in order to cross the threshold and generate political events. The kairos, the opportune moment that ruptures the monotony and repetitiveness of chronological time, this moment has to be grasped by a political subject. End of quote. So no democracy of the multitude without political organization and institutions, but not just any form of organization will do. So they say traditional, this is their words, traditional organizational forms based on unity and central leadership and hierarchy are neither desirable nor effective, end of quote. So in short, hegemony is not the answer. Now, the way in which Hart and Negri want to avoid what they see as the twin pitfalls of spontaneity on one side and hegemony on the other side comes out clearly in some passages here. They first note the necessity of constructing the multitude. They say the multitude is not a spontaneous political subject, but a project of political organization. A project of political organization. Thus shifting the discussion from being the multitude to making the multitude, end of quote. However, the multitude cannot be made through hegemony or in the shape of the people. So they continue, whereas the people is formed as a unity by a hegemonic power standing above the plural social field, the multitude is formed through articulations on the plane of immanence. The problem with hegemony then is that it imposes unity and identity where there's singularity, and that hegemony involves a transcendental move by an agent external to the multitude. In hegemony, in populism, the multitude is divided between the hegemonic agent and the rest of the multitude. And this is so because from the perspective of hegemony, the multitude can only come about, be made, as it were, through a relation of representation. In other words, from the perspective of hegemony and populism and so on, or this theory of populism, representation is constitutive. And of course, in this case, the multitude, if that is the case, then it's no longer the multitude, at least for Hart and Negri. So a key difference here is that for Leclerc and Mouffe, in the theory of hegemony, the people is always divided from itself in a way that the multitude can never be for Hart and Negri. Now, Hart and Negri So they want to avoid spontaneity and hegemony. Having changed their position this much, they now have some sort of theory of articulation or political subjectivity of the multitude. And they also developed that in the small book called Declaration from 2012, even if it may not be entirely clear exactly what this involves. But I would go one step further and argue that, of course, articulation and representation and hegemony are part of the multitude, and they were so from the very beginning. For instance, in Empire, Hart and Negri note that the struggles of the multitude need to communicate, that's their term, these struggles need to communicate with one another. This communication is made possible in two ways, they say. First, by clarifying the nature of the common enemy, and secondly, by constructing a common language that facilitates communication. And both of these tasks are said to be political tasks, according to Hart and Negri. And indeed, one could argue that this is a pretty good description of exactly what hegemony a la Laclau and Mouffe does. So the point here is that, like the people, the multitude is constituted through representation. Through representations by all of those who identify with the multitude, or those who don't identify with the multitude, all those who speak in the name of the multitude or speak of the multitude, all those who represent in one form or another the multitude. And it's not just about speaking, it's also about living and practicing. Likewise, horizontality, I would argue, is constituted within a representational space and through an element of verticality. Neither the multitude nor horizontality nor autonomy are natural or immediate. They must be instituted, and so we are on the plane of representation. Now, I want to look at, briefly, at some of the comments that Laclau and Mouffe and Hart and Negri have made on the emergence of left populism in Europe, especially Syriza and Podemos. And my idea here is to look at these comments they've been making over the last year or so, in order to see if that casts any light on their more theoretical theories, their theories of the multitude and the people. Now, Laclau and Mouffe's position is the most straightforward. So Laclau and Mouffe write about the necessity for these movements to become institutionalized in various ways. They write about the necessity to have some form of vertical relationship there, vertical dimension. And they both Laclau and Mouffe talk about the need to combine a logic of verticality, hegemony, with a logic of horizontality, which in Laclau's terms is the logic of equivalence. And it's within this schema of horizontal and vertical logics and the relationship between them that we have to understand Mouffe's comments on left-wing populism in Europe today. So very briefly, for Mouffe it's not sufficient, but it's necessary for political movements on the left to engage with political institutions. These movements must also see the possibilities that a populist discourse open up. It's this kind of populist discourse, so far mainly used by the far right, which can help a political movement make a real impact on state institutions by creating a leftist progressive majority. The Social Democrats have become part of the post-political center, and the far right have been able to mobilize the people, understood as the nation, through a discourse that draws on passions. This is her analysis. So a left-wing populism can be constructed around opposition to neoliberalism, and as such a project is also a way to put politics back into politics and to put democracy back into democracy. And it's also a winning strategy. So for Laclau and Mouffe, a populist political project has to connect the vertical politics of populism, the party and the state, with the horizontalist politics of social and political movements, like the Indignados. And this is so even if their focus is always mainly on the first of these, on the populist articulation of this political project and on how this can become state. Now, Hart and Negri, and here I have to rely on two short pieces written by Antonio Negri together with Hart and Negri's man on the ground in Spain. He's called Raúl Sánchez Cedillo. They were published in February this year. So Negri and Sánchez, they look at Syriza and Podemos and what's been happening in Greece and in Spain, and they acknowledge the transformative force of the populist interventions of Syriza and Podemos. And not only that, they acknowledge that Syriza and Podemos, they have achieved something which the indignados could not achieve. But they also add a corrective to this. Winning, they say, is not just about defeating the enemy on the enemy's own ground. In other words, it's not enough for a movement to become state, to become hegemonic. A war of movement is not enough if the positions conquered are not changed as well. You could say that it's not just a matter of different policies, different answers to the same old questions. One must also change the way in which politics is done. Because this is very much in line with the sort of discourse coming out of the indignados and the discourse of the multitude. Now, in order to make sure that the form of politics also changes, it's necessary not just to combine verticality and horizontality, populism and the multitude, but you have to connect the vertical politics to the horizontal movements. 0 minutes. Okay. So the Populist Party for Negri and Sanchez and populist government has to stay plugged into these social movements. And the danger is to think that the political, which they understand as the party, the state, representative institutions, that the political is autonomous from the social understood as in terms of the multitude and the social movements. Of course, now it could be argued that this leaves Hardt and Negri and Laclau and Mouffe rather close together. After all, they all argue that both verticality and horizontality are necessary and that the vertical politics of the state, of populism, has to be plugged into the horizontal politics of new social and political movements. But I think there are still very important differences here, which perhaps we can discuss later, including the way in which they understand the political. But what I think is for them maybe not just a political but also a theoretical question. For Podemos in Spain, this is one of the key questions they are facing right now. How can Podemos, as a political movement, how can Podemos stay a movement, a political movement, and not becoming ossified as a traditional party, as part of a more traditional hierarchical state where it's politics as usual? I think that this is one of the key challenges for Podemos today at this point. And it may be the case as well here with Syriza, that they are facing the same sort of challenges. Thanks.
Okay, I'd like to thank you all for being here after such a long and tiring day. And I would especially like to thank Cristobal for helping us fill the gap of Mark. So this is quite appropriate day to talk about Syriza. I guess the most appropriate day to talk about Syriza. So I'll skip the rather obvious stuff that I guess we all know. We all know that Syriza emerged after 2012 as a contender of power in Greece, and in January it took power. So the rise of Syriza poses a series of challenges for political scientists, both because the new radical left is a terra incognita in research. It's been under-researched, and because at the same time left-wing populism in Europe is similarly underdeveloped. So Syriza was broadly, almost intuitively, recognized as populist by both journalists and political scientists. So my aim at this paper is to address the peculiarities of Syriza's left-wing egalitarian populism and to assess the preconditions of its electoral dynamic. So a few stuff about theory. It's a good thing that I'm already covered, so I'm going to skim this through this very quickly. There's been a turn to Sartorian minimal definitions, and I think that's a very good thing. It seems that, as Cristobal was saying yesterday, we're reaching a consensus. We can say that today we're more or less on the same page regarding the theory of populism, even though we have several disagreements. So the only main problem that I can trace, and Yannis argued about this also, with some of the minimal definitions, I call this the Dutch school, because Moede, Van Kessel, Rodijn, several other people are from the Netherlands. They're using the minimal definition, but Cristobal adds a Latin American twist to this picture. So they do not seem minimal enough sometimes, because they have this, they emphasize the element of morality and the homogenizing character. of populism regarding the people. So what happens if we put these elements aside? I think we end up with minimal definitions highlighted by Yanis, the emphasis to the people. This is the minimal definition, the minimal criteria that we're using in the Populismus project. And the representation of society as divided between antagonistic camps, the people and the elite, or the underdog, the establishment, that form antagonistic chains of equivalencies. And here, of course, we have the additional criterion added by Mude and Calvasser, Cristobal, that populists argue that politics should be an expression of the popular will. So what I recognize as further tasks when researching populist phenomena, to delve into the specific contents of the people as a subject and the way in which the antagonistic divide with the elite is signified. And I think that I should stress the particular importance of the antagonistic logic that we see in the late work of Laclau, because this might help us recognize what we could call pre-populist or proto-populist tendencies. So now to the empirical case. Syriza was once a marginal coalition of parties stemming from a split from the KKE, late 60s. It emerges in 2004 as a coalition of parties and polls only around 4 to 5%. So it surges in the polls and reaches 36.4% in 2015. In a sense, we can say that it's one of the main byproducts of the crisis. And here's just the electoral results from October 2009 until January, and you can see how New Democracy in PASOK, let's say the old party establishment, collapses and Syriza surges, along with some other new parties. A few things about the background, the very recent political history, the political environment in which Syriza emerges. So from the restoration of democracy in Greece in 1974 until the early to mid-90s, we had a classic two-party system in Greece, a rather polarized two-party system. After the mid-90s, the main two parties of the center-right and center-left steadily converge, and we have rather a consensus model which we see in other countries, what Mouffe has described as the post-political zeitgeist. So with the break of the crisis, this consensus between the two main parties is even more highlighted. Now the two parties don't just agree on several issues, now they can co-govern together from the 2011 to 2015, along with some other small parties, an extreme right populist party and a moderate center-left party. So, and we all know that they implement a very hard program, a very harsh austerity program with severe budget cuts, which is met with massive social unrest. So why Syriza was successful now? There's going to be a bit of back and forth in this paper, but I think if it's not too tiring, it can help us understand the trajectory from 2004 until today. So I believe that we have to look at Syriza's discourse from the very beginning and the role of antagonism and polarization that has played from then onwards. So Syriza in 2004, the very formation of Syriza comes as an answer to the long identity crisis of the Greek non-communist left. It's turned from post-materialist values and from the way that it posits itself within the Greek political party system, within the political party antagonism. From 2004 onwards, maybe a bit earlier too, in the form of Synaspismos, the main constituent of Syriza, it adopts a strategy of establishing polarizations whenever given the opportunity in a bid to force social subjects that were involved in various kinds of struggle, and especially the youth, to take sides and thus become actively politicized. The quotes I have here is from a central political committee decision of Synaspismos, the main constituent of Syriza in 2005. What Synaspismos diagnosed back then was a prevailing centrist neoliberal consensus across the political landscape, and Syriza declared that it would actively try to disturb the prevailing homogeneity, as they called it, of the socio-political space, so the, quote, true dividing lines might come to surface. And I believe that that's the birthplace of a new logic for the Greek non-communist left, or of the Greek radical left, if you wish, now the populist radical left. So Syriza called its members to actively participate in social movements, not from a vanguardist perspective, but rather as individuals that would respect the autonomy of the movement and then return to the party with experience, knowledge, to help transform the identity of the party in a way to bring it closer to the agonies and the social struggles of the precarious or the mobilizing social strata. So the first step of this strategy, this was a declared and planned strategy that we can see in official documents of Synaspismos and Syriza, entailed the active participation of Syriza's cadres and members in various social movements, which means partly identification with these movements, because it was an active part of these movements. And the second step was the task of representing them in the central political scene. So there is a dialectic here between identification and representation. So support practically towards and close interaction with social movements meant specifically interacting with the counter-globalization movement. This was very crucial in transforming the identity of the Greek radical left from the early zeros, from 2000, the social forums. Second, the student protests, the massive student protests we had in Greece in 2006 and 2007, and the youth uprising in December 2008. After the killing of a 15-year-old boy by a police officer in Athens. So these movements were articulated, not only these movements, several others, but these were the main ones, were articulated in a chain of equivalence. I'm not going to go through what chain of equivalence is because Lasse explained this very eloquently. These movements became constant themes in Syriza's discourse, symbolizing a broad anti-neoliberal and anti-establishment struggle. So the nodal points for this period were the youth and the movements in general. And the antagonistic other were mainly the two-party establishment as agents of neoliberalism, especially after 2007 and when the global financial crisis emerges. We have on the camp of the political opponent, the camp of the enemy, also the banks and the bankers and the big business. So just to summarize the general scheme of antagonism, I'm talking about the period from 2004 until 2009, 2010. Syriza tries to represent in its discourse, this period, certain social struggles and demands through establishing sharp antagonistic, sharp us versus them polarities and antagonistic dividing lines, in which us meant the social strata that were losing and being marginalized by the process of neoliberal globalization. And on the other side were the few winners, those that Syriza regarded as the few winners, the political, economic, media, elite, the establishment, the two-party system, and so on. So Syriza declared that it aspired to act as a disruptive force within the political system and to give voice to those without a voice. This is actually a quote from official documents of Syriza and of speeches of Tsipras, especially in 2008. This was a very often used as a scheme, giving voice to the voiceless. So by 2009, 2010, when the crisis emerges, Syriza had established a strong presence within social movements and activist initiatives, but remained a rather marginal political force. So my hypothesis here is that this happened because the movements to which Syriza appealed were rather fragmented, not really communicated, really connected to each other. And the middle classes that form the biggest part of the Greek society were still relevantly well off. So they were maintaining their attachment, one might say reluctant attachments, with the main two parties, PASOK and New Democracy. So until the break of the Greek crisis, we could say that Syriza's populism was articulated from a rather minoritarian position, failing to establish an effective dialectic of representation between particularity and universality, between the youth as a partial subject and the people as a universal subject. And after all, Syriza didn't aspire to take power back then, didn't embark on a hegemonic project. It declared that it wanted to act as a fighting opposition. But as the crisis deepened and austerity hit the vast majority of the population, and especially the middle and lower social strata, the preconditions for a unified anti-establishment and anti-austerity movement, and thus of a counter-hegemonic project, the formation of a challenger party, began to take place. So, very briefly, let me take you back to May 2011. Fotinia Michalis already talked about the Antagonism, so I don't have to get into any details. I think you mentioned it, right? The Antagonism were a social movement that was gathered in the Greek squares after the Spanish squares, and assembled hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Athens and many other cities, demanding an end to austerity and the return of power to the people and true democracy. And true democracy was later turned into direct democracy, but this doesn't really matter. For Syriza, this movement exemplified a deep crisis of representation within the Greek political system and a potentially new social majority. So again, Syriza employed a very similar strategy to the one it had employed before. It tried, because the Antagonism weren't the only social movement. When austerity hit Greece, we have several local movements on different issues that Syriza called upon and tried to actively articulate against the government, against austerity. So now it described the new collective subject that it envisioned as a new popular unity, a new popular majority, which would consist of this plurality of social demand struggles and identities. So, and we come at what I call a moment of truth for Syriza in 2012, when in the pre-election period, I think after the first elections of May, when Syriza realized that its dynamic was even better than it could imagine. For the first time, it declared that it aspires to capture power. It speaks about a government of the left, calling to other left parties to support the possibility of the formation of a government of the left. So I don't have to say a lot about the notion of crisis and how we understand it in the project. Yannis covered this already. We can theorize this, the break of the crisis and the austerity as what Kenneth Roberts calls a crisis of political representation, and what Laclau terms in his theory as dislocation, a moment where a traumatic experience cannot be absorbed in the symbolic hegemonic order. So Syriza was, at this stage, at a rather favorable place to address subjects that were entering a more fluid stage, because they were disidentifying from previous party references, preferences, PASOK and New Democracy, because they were marginalized, impoverished, they had much to lose, they were constantly, they were caught up in a downward social mobility spiral. So this type of interpellation that Syriza now attempted was very close to what Carlos de la Torre describes as a politics of cultural and symbolic recognition, which consists in making, this is a quotation from a recent book, 2015, consists in making what is unseen visible, in making what was audible as mere noise heard as speech. You see, Carlos de la Torre describes in 2015 what were the actual words of Syriza back then, giving voice to those without a voice. So indeed, Syriza put forth a new antagonistic schema. Now it called upon the people as a universal subject, as the broad anti-austerity, anti-memoranda front versus the pro-austerity forces, mainly PASOK and New Democracy again, but also the privileged few, the oligarchy, the greedy bankers, big business, and so on. So now we have almost an ideal type kind of discourse with a sharp antagonistic vision of society, which, as I described, was already there from 2004, and we see how this develops. So what was the missing element? It's quite obvious, the moment of dislocation, a crisis deep enough that could trigger a political realignment. So after 2009, this moment of dislocation triggered an uncontrolled dynamic of disidentification and defection of voters. I think I already showed you why Syriza was placed in a favorable position. I want to quickly mention why other anti-establishment parties couldn't capitalize on the crisis. The Greek Communist Party on the left was rather hostile to the various anti-austerity movements, and especially hostile to the Antagonism movement, because the last decades it adopts a rather sectarist position. It prefers to organize its own demonstration with its members, and it's rather hostile to any social mobilization that it cannot control. On the other side of the spectrum, on the right, the populist extreme right party, Popular Orthodox Rally, Laos actually means the people, the acronym, had rendered itself unable to address the frustrated social strata because it supported the pro-austerity policies. It actually participated in a government, coalition government under the technocrat Lukas Papadimos. As a result, Syriza managed to establish itself as the most viable political representative of anti-memorandum, anti-austerity sentiments. So to conclude, I'd like to stress two peculiarities of Syriza's populism, which I think highlight the merits of a discursive minimal criteria and pose some, okay, great, I'm going to make it, some problems to other approaches. So I think that Syriza's discourse is not, even though it's clearly populist, it's not a primarily moralist discourse. The way that it constructs the divide with the elites is not a primarily moralist one. I don't imply that there aren't moralist elements, but there are moral elements in every discourse in a democratic society, and this brings us back to the work, among many others, of Michael Oakeshott and Margaret Canavan, who say that always discourses around democracy contain a redemptive element. Political projects are supposed to bring something better for the people they're promising. So there are always elements of a moralist discourse in every kind of political project. So we need a way to somehow identify or somehow to measure moralism in discourses, to say that moralism is primary and all the others are secondary, the ideological, political, socio-economic aspects of a discourse. Also, the construction of the people, even though many theorists, Cristobal among them, have stressed, and they are indeed right, because most of the populist movement are indeed adopting a homogenizing perception of the people. But still, I think that there are some new populist movements that are stressing plurality and heterogeneity, which is quite a different story. So what I propose here is to talk about partial unification and horizontal or equivalent articulation, the term that Laclau puts it, because partial unification in the sense of the change of equivalence doesn't imply homogeneity necessarily. Of course, this is something we can discuss. And just to conclude, Syriza's discourse, as I guess it's obvious, fulfills the two main minimal criteria that we put forward in the project. I believe that a discursive approach facilitates better an understanding of the development of the specific logic that defines its appeal, because it helps us through focusing on the very logic to follow it from 2004 onwards, when it's not obviously populist. And it poses some certain challenges to mainstream approaches, as I've shown, and some future prospects. This is seriously the last slide. So Syriza came from opposition to power, and we were discussing these days also how a populist movement, the populist party, transforms itself when in power. There are certain challenges, how institutionalizing antagonism, how to construct or maintain antagonism, and what consequences this might have for society. Syriza is doing this for now by using a strong language against the few rich, still against the oligarchs, the ones that haven't paid their fair share during austerity. And now we also see a strong language against European neoliberal elites, or the so-called extreme circles within the institutions, within the lenders. And one last thing that it's extremely timely because we're living through this today is the materiality, aspects of the materiality of antagonism. First, this one might say that this was expressed by competing demonstrations outside the parliament, the ones that were anti-austerity, demanding for even a break with our European partners, and other demonstrations that demonstrated in favor of a deal at any social cost. And now the referendum. What if a yes wins at the referendum? Syriza has stated that they'll just sign the agreement because the people have spoken. But how is antagonism then going to continue? Because the people then will have spoken, and they will have spoken against what Syriza says in the name of the people. So there are a series of challenges, and I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.